Thank you, Becca, for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming to see this. What I would like to do is actually start with a brief meditation. Surprise. So at the highest level, this talk is really about diversity and individual differences. And it's going to be about giving an underrepresented people a voice that hasn't really been part of this conversation so far. So I thought in order to kind of create the right kind of container for this talk, it might be helpful to think of a time when the dominant narrative didn't represent you, a time when you weren't the average. So an example is women are 5'4" and 135 pounds, and I'm not. So, something like that, but something that's salient, that where you stood out, you were different. So just taking a moment to think of that time, or maybe just in this room right now, is there anything about you where you feel different from everyone in this room? There's something about you that maybe you haven't told anyone. So just taking a moment to feel that difference and the emotions that go with it. Maybe feeling left out, perhaps excluded, maybe silenced, or even shunned. So taking a moment to feel that in your body, in your heart. And to the extent possible, bringing that sense of care and honoring of difference into this presentation. And also, probably most importantly, a sense of compassion for the deep challenge that is ahead of us for honoring difference. This is a tough topic, and I've been really encouraged by seeing a topic that has been very prominent already today, but also throughout the program. So that's really exciting. Okay. So I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been working on for the last 10 years, but that I was just, that's called the Varieties of Contemplative Experience project, and this is the first paper from the project, and it was published about a month ago in the PLOS One, which is the Public Library of Sciences. And so you can download the paper. How many people have read the paper? Okay, so the paper has kind of everything in it, so I'm not going to be able to touch on everything today. So please, if you feel compelled to after this talk, please download the paper. It's free, it's open access. But just notice that there are supplemental files. There are 5 appendices. It's a massive, giant paper, and it has 5 appendices. But those are really important because they contain all the sort of the laundry list of difficulties and issues. So that's kind of where the meat is, and it's a little bit hidden. So I just wanted to point that out. I also want to point out that there is a workshop, a whole day workshop to unpack this extremely complex topic on Tuesday. So I'm going to try to give you an overview, of the study today. I'm going to go through the phenomenology, which is the actual experience of the difficulties. I'm going to talk about influencing factors, or why certain difficulties come up for certain people, or why they're difficult for certain people. And that's basically the paper, so I'm going to kind of just run through the paper and save you the time reading it. But what you're going to get today, which isn't in the paper, are actual quotes from the participants. So this is sort of unpublished data, and I'm going to ask you for the quotes to not take photos of those slides. So I actually put the no photos thing on certain slides. Just don't take photos of those. Anything else is fair game. And of course, most of it's from the paper. So after the quotes, I'm also going to go through frequently asked questions, and I think there'll probably be ones that are on your mind already. Of course, how is this study relevant to MBIs? And then future directions and resources again, which of course is going to be partly the Tuesday day. So the central questions of the study, of the Varieties of Contemplative Experience study, were, what are the range of experiences that occur as a result of contemplative practices? We've heard a lot about the positive ones, and so we made a specific effort to query about the ones that are more difficult, unexpected, challenging, even distressing, or even impairing. So that was a specific probe in our questions. And basically what we did was we went to meditation centers, Dharma centers, and we went to the Dharma teachers, the directors of these centers who've been running centers for meditation retreats, classes for 30 years, and we asked them, what kind of difficulties have you seen? Have you observed in your students? And they, every Dharma center had 5, stories, sort of like worst case scenarios that I was like, they would tell these stories, and I would ask, is there any way that I can get in touch with those people? And they would send my contact information to those people. Some of them wrote back, some of them didn't. So we're documenting kind of some of the worst case scenarios. But what was also interesting was that a lot of the times the Dharma teachers themselves would be like, well, when it happened to me, and then you're like, what? And then the Dharma teacher themselves would become a subject in the study. So in the end, we ended up with more than 60% of the people that we interviewed about themselves were teachers. So we have 2 types of interviews, what we call the practitioner or the meditator interviews, who are talking about their own experience. And then we have teacher interviews where they're talking about their clients or their students. So it's 2 different kinds of interviews, but a lot of them ended up being teachers. Some of the experts were also clinicians, so we included that category. They didn't consider themselves Dharma teachers or meditation teachers. They considered themselves like mindfulness-based clinicians. But they'd also worked with a lot of difficulties, and so we included some of those. So the methodology, there were semi-structured interviews, and within qualitative methodology, if you don't know something about, if it's a very new phenomenon, you don't want to just pummel people with questions, because then you're really like inserting your views into something. So we really kind of just said what happened and let the recorder run. It was a very, very open-ended kind of thing, but we did have some basic categories, which we asked people to tell us about, their backgrounds and their practice histories, and like what kind of practices were you doing, what kind of tradition are you in, that kind of thing. And then we asked them, what happened, and let them talk about phenomenology. We asked them to be we tried to get them to be very plain in their language. So if they said, like, I had a Kundalini awakening, we were like, okay, can you rephrase that? What do you mean by that exactly? And we would sort of categorize Kundalini awakening under interpretation. So we tried to separate out the actual experience, the phenomenology, from the interpretation. So the interpretation was a separate question, like, how did you make sense of what happened to you? How did other people, teachers, doctors, friends, loved ones, how did they make sense of it for you? Like, what were the kind of interpretive frameworks they used? And then most importantly, because this is not just an academic, like, what are the effects of contemplative practices, but like, what do we do about it? What do we do as a field? I'm a clinician, I wanna be able to help people. So like, very, very practically, what are the remedies? So that was the basic, that's what the interview was. And then we did an analysis. So we have about 3,000 pages of data, of stories, none of which are published yet. And you're gonna see a couple of them today, but that's the data that you'll be seeing, and the paper is really just a summary of that. So we transcribed it, coded it. Each one took about 40 hours to do, which is why it took so long. And we have interdisciplinary explanations and risk factors and remedies. So in terms of who the people were, we were careful these were meditators that characterize themselves as practicing a Buddhist form of meditation in the Theravada, Zen, or Tibetan traditions, and we tried to be equal, we tried to be equal between them. So there are 20 meditators from each of the main schools of Buddhism, and we also tried to be have an equal gender ratio. So it was almost 50-50 male-female. In terms of practitioner demographics, there was a huge range in how much people had meditated, but we did have, about a quarter of people had what you would consider experts, meaning they had more than 10,000 hours of practice, but there was a really wide range. And like I said before, about 60% of the people talking about themselves, the practitioner interviews, were themselves teachers. So in terms of phenomenology, this is sort of the laundry list of difficulties or categories. We came up with 59 different categories, arranged into 7 domains: cognitive, perceptual, affective, which is also emotional, somatic or body, conative, which is motivational, sense of self, and social. And so I'm going to go through each one of these and give you just a flavor of what I mean by each category. Again, this is all in the paper. And then for some of them, I'm going to give you a taste from the practitioners themselves, because I think it's really important to not just imagine what you think I mean, but like really hear their words, because I think they're pretty compelling. Okay, so cognitive had to do with thought frequency and content. So that could be way too many thoughts or no thoughts at all. It could be content, and particularly that went into like delusions that had like a psychotic kind of nature to them. Change in executive function, so problems with memory or planning. Loss of conceptual meaning structures. So I've heard a lot about the conceptual mind and non-conceptuality, and maybe it would be a good idea to decrease our conceptuality and so forth. And I thought it would be interesting to hear the result of that. Someone who is practicing a kind of practice where they were intentionally trying to decrease their conceptual mind and like some of the unintended consequences of that. So she says, the meditation that I was doing was really confusing my mind's ability to access memory, including the most basic things, looking at a stoplight and seeing the color come up, but then having to think, but what does that mean again? And having to remember whether it meant stop or go. So the color red, no longer, she saw the color red, she was registering red, but she wasn't sure what it meant. This particular story, she said that if there hadn't been a car in front of her, she wouldn't have stopped. So you can see why, like, sometimes you need concepts. Those are good to have. And also I'll mention that we've had a lot of post-retreat car accidents, which is probably not surprising. I was kind of shutting down the humanness of what I am, and practicing letting go of concepts during my busy, active life was actually sabotaging my mind's ability to lay down new memories and reinforce old memories of simple things like what words mean, what colors mean, and I really had trouble speaking. I had trouble word finding. I stuttered when I tried to talk. Sorry. Okay, so that was the cognitive domain. For the perceptual domain, perceptual hypersensitivity is one of the ones that we see a lot. And you know, perceptual hypersensitivity, we've all had this, where colors get brighter, sounds get louder, and it's actually pretty cool, especially in the visual domain. It's like, ooh, like everything looks kind of different and new. But it can also be extremely, sounds can get too loud to the point where we're really like dysfunctional. For the affective domain, the affective domain kind of went in all directions. Fear, anxiety, paranoia, that was one of our most common, it was the most common category. Re-experience of trauma, I'm gonna read you examples of each one, but also the opposite. So we had sort of too much emotion, but also too little emotion. So it could go in kind of either direction. So here's an example of fear. I recall sitting one day and I don't know what happened. I was very calm, and then all of a sudden, the deepest, most intense fear I'd ever had an experience of in my entire life totally gripped me. My heart was pounding. I thought I was going to pass out or die or something. It was so awful, and I just stopped. Another one on fear. As I began to explore sensations as a direct experience, contraction or heat, whenever I turned my attention toward them, an overwhelming sense of dread and panic would overwhelm me, and I found it very difficult to sustain my attention on them because I would be so flooded with fear, exhaustion, panic, confusion. And that was very baffling because up to this point, meditation had been very validating. This particular guy was a monk when this was happening, and he was one of the people where he had pretty severe difficulties for more than a decade after this happened. Re-experiencing, I started to do a lot of shamatha meditation, and I started to have little flashback memories of sexual abuse and other abuse issues that were incredibly frightening. And that basically once, it felt like I kind of let the genie out of the bottle, so to speak. I mean, I went from being ignorant about those issues to having it come up constantly in my mind, and it was the actual practice of sitting generally that made it worse. So those are two examples of where emotions seem to be too much. And then here's an example of sort of the opposite. I had 2 young children. I couldn't feel anything about them. I couldn't connect with them. I went through all of the routines, the bedtime routine, getting them ready and kissing them and all that stuff, but there was no emotional connection. It was like I was dead. I was really like the living dead. It was like being in a hell realm for a year. So this one may be sort of horrifying to hear, but I've given this talk before. I gave a talk at Berkeley, and there was a Buddhist scholar there named John Donne. Many of you probably know him. And he was like raising his hand like, this is exactly what these practices were intended to do. They're meant to decrease affective attachment to our loved ones so that we can better renounce the world. So I think it's important to note, we'll talk about culture later, but that different people hear these stories and they hear different things. For the person it was happening to, it was definitely not what she had intended. Okay, for the somatic one, energy or vibrations, which sounds, it can be like feelings of like electricity running through the body. It can be very, very impairing to have that. And also related to sleep changes, particularly insomnia. If you have energy, if you have electricity running through your body all night, it's kind of hard to sleep. So those were some of the 12 somatic changes. Cognitive changes, again, this is motivation, can go in either direction, like I'm on fire, I can just meditate, all I want to do is meditate, it's all I want to talk about, versus the opposite, I have no desire to do anything, I have no desires, motivations, so both directions. Okay, sense of self. This is one I want to take a little bit more time with. One, because I don't think, when I say more emotions, I think you know what I mean. If I say re-experiencing of trauma, I think you know what I mean. But I think changes in sense of self are actually a little bit less intuitive to understand. So there's a lot of different kinds of changes in sense of self, and a couple of them that I want to talk about are changes in sense of ownership over your body, over your thoughts, emotions, body sensations. You can also have a change in your sense of ownership over action, which we call changes in agency. So sense of embodiment, so where you are relative to your body, you might be outside of it, you might be located, like I feel like I'm behind my eyes right now, but I might be down here, so it might be a different change in location within the body or outside the body. And then change in self, other, self-world boundaries. So here are some examples of change in ownership. This guy was also a monk. I didn't have a sense of my body belonging to me. There wasn't a sense of me there. I couldn't feel my hand, but I could feel my hand, but it wasn't my hand. It didn't feel like my hand, my chest, my head. Change in self-other boundaries. So this is an interesting one. I was hearing a lot about this yesterday, a lot in John Teasdale's talk about non-separation, communion. There are all these like really lovely words that sounded really great. But here's a slightly different take on that. So this woman says, I went out for a walk with a friend of mine, and he started talking, and I said, Jonathan, please be quiet. Be quiet, because he was inside of me talking, and it was so loud. I mean, physically, he was inside of me, because I was the space. And I would shift in and out of the space, in and out, and the mind didn't know what to do with it. The mind was scared. It couldn't control anything. It didn't have anything to hang on to. And there's another one. This is more of a basic sense of self. So this is a kind of the most minimal sense of self. She says, I just had no center. I was walking on the street, and then in the blink of an eye, that was the end of me. I was gone. I was lost. There was nothing there. I didn't believe I even had a shadow. I didn't believe anyone could even see me. It was terrible. I had a driveway, and I had to have a fence there so I could hold on to the fence. So she built a fence from her house to her car, and she would move along the fence. In the house, I had to hold on to the fence. I had to hold on to the furniture. That was the anchor I needed. I felt like I was going to disappear into the air. In retrospect, it was really living in hell. So this woman was a school teacher, and she managed to, she would get to the car by going down the fence. She would buckle herself in, because she felt like she was made of air, and she would just disappear into the air. And so when she would get to the school, she had told a couple of people who would help walk her to the school room, and she would hold on to the furniture in the schoolroom. And this went on for 9 years. This is another one for basic sense of self. I picked this one because this guy is, I think many of you have gone through clinical training, and so this particular guy is in clinical training, and he's in that stage of clinical training where you're sitting with clients, but you're being videotaped. So you're really trying to be there with them, but you're kind of also aware that like you're being evaluated. So he's in that stage of his clinical training, and he's not feeling like he exists. So he says, whenever I'm sitting in a room with a client one-on-one, I become hyper-aware of not having a self, and the client sitting across from me not having a self, and of nothing being real, just this profound sense of deadness and emptiness, and not knowing what to say or what to do with my clients, which is definitely not a good place to be. I need to be able to think about my clients. And he goes on to say, I so desperately wanted to say, help me, make me real, make me come back. I need you to make me real, look at me, acknowledge me, touch me, do something to make me real. There was a real desperation to this, but no matter what anybody said or did, my sense of having a real self would just not come back. So not surprisingly, the last category is social and occupational impairment. So you can see pretty obviously how that might impair your social and occupational impairment, so I won't go into that. But a lot of people feel like a tremendous amount of shame, and also have a lot of, their issues bring up a lot of conflict in their communities, and they feel, sometimes they're actively shunned. So that's also part of the story. So let's see. We asked each person to rate their impairment from mild, moderate to severe, and severe impairment would be like a 50% reduction in your previous ability to function, something like that, 50, 25, or less. So you can see here, and then we had physical, cognitive, social, motivational, role, occupational, educational, and self-harm, different kinds of impairment. So 73% indicated moderate to severe impairment in at least one domain, 17% reported suicidality, 17% required inpatient hospitalization. In terms of symptom impairment and duration was fairly significant. So the average was about 1 to 3 years, but with a huge variability from more than, sometimes a few days to more than 2 decades. So I think that this is one of the take-home messages of the study, which was that the phenomena itself was fairly consistent. Every single category of the 59 was experienced by at least 20 people. But there was a huge variability of response of whether that, like, having that specific category was even distressing. For some people, that wasn't, like, they would report, not having a sense of self, but it wasn't distressing. For other people, it was the worst thing that had ever happened to them. And the related impairment as well. So it seemed like there was just a huge variability in response. So that made us have to do more in the study than just list what they were, but try to figure out, are there any sort of predictors of why a given experience might be, last longer or be more distressing for one person than another. So that came to this other category, and there's a code book for these as well, that are called influencing factors. So there's 26 categories of influencing factors arranged into 4 higher order domains: practice, practitioner, relationships, and health behaviors. So for practice, things like, well, what practice were you doing? And amount and intensity of practice. So those are pretty obvious ones. Practitioner, psychiatric and trauma history. What were their intentions? Why were they meditating in the first place? What were their goals? Were they doing it for health reasons? Were they doing it to be enlightened? What were their motivations? And then one of the things that became extremely important was their worldview and explanatory framework. So depending on how they made sense of their experience, like through a biomedical view or a Buddhist view or a psychological view, like that really made an impact. And then on top of that, there was sort of this tertiary layer that many people had very different, there were multiple interpretive frameworks in almost every story available to everyone, and that's true right now. So we're probably all thinking according to our own training, and that might be multiple trainings, like, well, which one of these frameworks is the correct one? So that became its own kind of symptom in that the confusion over which interpretive framework to use is sort of its own thing that we have to address. So here's an example of someone. So this one is a really interesting case because this was actually, so these are all Dharma teachers. They've written, many of them have written many books. You've read these books. And this particular guy had his difficulty while he was teaching a retreat. So imagine if I'm the teacher and you guys are all, I'm directing you to do the practice and I'm starting to have this experience while I'm up here. So this is the experience. Well, I'm way behind, sorry. He says, and then he goes to another Buddhist teacher to ask for help, and he gets this like very Buddhist interpretation, like, oh, you're in the 4th jhana, that's like when PT is too high or something like that. And he's like, okay. He's like, the teacher gives me this whole explanation that sounds perfect, but I feel like he doesn't understand the instability. It just makes me wonder about many of these old maps that we use that might overlap with psychiatric diagnoses in a way where psychiatric maps might actually be better, and clearer sometimes. So I'm stuck between maps. But the one that I'm using to be a functioning person right now is definitely a psychiatric one, and that includes psychopharmacology. But I really don't know. So what happened to him was that he was watching a woman that he was teaching, and he felt like that she was breathing at the same rate as him. And so he's like, that's interesting. I'll slow down my breathing. And then as he did that, she slowed down her breathing. And then suddenly they were like the same person, which again sounds like, yeah, unity, non-separation. But it really scared him. And this is someone, again, this is like a very seasoned Dharma teacher has taught, hundreds of retreats. And that was not what he wanted. Okay, relationship to teacher and sociocultural context. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. Relationship to teacher was really interesting also because it was very sort of bimodal, and that it was both one of the things that people reported as being the most helpful and the most harmful. So I think that the attention that we're giving right now to like what makes a good teacher, what is teacher competence, what are good teacher qualities, I think is a really important research question that could really make or break it from certain people. And then social cultural context I'm going to talk about later. Health behaviors, what people were eating, how much they exercised, the degree to which they had done psychotherapy, medical treatment concurrently with their issues, whether they took medication, all of that had an impact on how long or how distressing these experiences were. Sorry. Okay, so we're on to frequently asked questions. So these are ones I've heard. I hope I get all of them, but I'm sure there'll be more. So one is the causal role of meditation. How do you know that this wouldn't have just happened anyway? Like, how do you know that meditation was actually playing a causal role? Second question is pre-existing vulnerability. Maybe we just need to screen people better, and there's certain people that shouldn't meditate. And like, maybe all of these people had, something latently wrong with them, and so, we should really try to figure that out. Intensity of practice. Does this only happen on meditation retreats, really intense practice, and therefore, if you do MBIs, we don't really need to worry about it. Quality of supervision. Maybe this only happens to people who just don't have good teachers, aren't getting good instruction, or don't have any teachers, or listening to apps. So these are all things that are commonly sort of circulated assumptions. Another question is this progress or pathology? A lot of these things kind of look like progress, depending on what type of interpretive framework you put on it. So like, how do you tell the difference? Are these relevant to MBIs? Maybe this is just Buddhist people, and they're doing a different thing than we're doing in MBIs, and so this is just a separate thing. How worried should we be? What's the frequency or prevalence? And related to that, like some issues around monitoring, and then what about neurobiological mechanisms? So I'm gonna try to do all that. Okay, so causality assessment, again, this is all in the paper, but we used 11 of 13 causality assessment criteria that are used by regulatory agencies like the World Health Organization and the FDA to assess the safety of medical devices. So one of those was prior published reports. So we found 40 published reports of other kinds of meditation-related difficulties in the clinical literature. This is not counting the Buddhist literature. So this is the clinical scientific literature. We also had expert judgment. So we had meditation teachers saying this is caused by meditation. So we had 32 of them. Subjective attribution, which is the person themselves thought it was caused by meditation. Temporal proximity, meaning it happened during meditation or shortly after. Exacerbation means that that something you already had got worse when you started meditating. De-challenge means it went away when you stopped meditating. Re-challenge means it came back. Specificity means that alternative causes were ruled out. So if people had, they said, oh, I lost my sense of self, but like it was just like that acid trip I had, that doesn't count. So if they had had a very unusual experience prior to meditating from like a drug experience or an illness, then they were ruled out. So it had to be sort of first time it happened was with meditation. And then there were a couple of cases where it came out in their interview that it wasn't clear. So those people were not included in the analysis either. And then we have 3 types of consistency: intra, inter, and cross-modal, meaning that each category was reported by 20 people and at least 4 experts, so things like that. And then the remaining 2 are biological gradient and linkage to biological mechanisms, which I will address speculatively at the end. So let's go through these. That was the causality criteria. That was the first one. So what about practice intensity? Is this only happening on meditation retreats in extremely high level practitioners? And we found that the answer was no. Meditation intensity is definitely a factor, but it doesn't account for all the cases. So we found that 70% of them, it did happen on retreat or following retreat. But for 30%, it happened in the case of just daily practice. And you have like 40% or 10 hours or more, so that's a lot of practice. But that a quarter of them had happened, who are doing meditation 1 hour or less a day. So it's a minority, but it's still something that we should pay attention to. What about pre-existing vulnerability? So this population was extremely high functioning. More than 75% of them had MDs or PhDs. So we're talking about their graduate degrees, the top 5% of educational attainment. And the majority did not have a psychiatric illness or trauma history. So it's not that those factors are not playing a role, because they are for sure, but they're not the complete story. And if you don't have a psych or trauma history, or you're working with someone who doesn't, that doesn't mean that you don't need to be watching. Like it doesn't free from the risk. In terms of incorrect practice or poor supervision, in the case of these people, again, these are very famous Dharma teachers who trained in Asia. A lot of them were monks. They trained in the best monasteries that we have like in our world right now. So these are not people that are and then these are meditation teachers, often lineage holders in different traditions. So for sure, people who are doing apps and are totally unsupervised, like that's a whole other issue. But for this study, they were very well supervised. 60% were teachers. More than 70% were actively working with the teacher or were in a meditation community. So the point is this can happen even under optimal conditions. Okay. What about progress or pathology? So I think that it's very difficult to tell whether this is like a good thing or pathology. And I'll generally say that we had this fantasy that when we started this study that we were going to have a consensus. Like we would just interview all these teachers, and they would all be like, well, that is a meditation effect, and that is psychopathology, and we would just like have this amazing chart and be able to like give it to you all. That was the fantasy. So there was like no consensus at all, and this is kind of why. If you this isn't surprising if you look back at the literature on, meditation-related difficulties are well documented in all forms of Buddhism. The Tibetans call them yams. In Zen, they're called makyo. There's something called Zen sickness or meditation sickness. In the Theravada tradition, there's something called the stages of insight. Both the corruptions of insight and the insight knowledges, which are described in both the 5th century text, the Visuddhimagga by Buddhaghosa, and Mahasi Sayadaw's Progress of Insight. They're known to be really difficult. They include stages like terror and dissolution, disenchantment. So these are well documented, but even between Buddhist traditions and even within them, and different teachers within the same tradition, sometimes they say like, these are just side effects, don't worry about them, they don't mean anything, you just keep going. Other ones are like, whoa, the same exact effect, you need to stop and do something else. It's just, so very, very different kinds of interpretations of each one of these. We wrote a paper on visual lights, like they're called tigle or nimitta. No one's nodding, so they're just like a very specific kind of effect. They're kind of benign. But we wrote an entire paper about how different traditions like see those like as really important, like super important, or like completely you should just ignore it kind of thing. So the point is that even within Buddhism, there's no consensus about really any of these, different kinds of what these mean in terms of like they're a good sign or they're a bad sign or they don't mean anything. There's a huge array of different interpretations, which is why everyone in our study was getting different interpretations. Many people, the same exact person with the same, experience would go to different teachers and get like completely different interpretations. You need to stop meditating. This is a bad sign. You're ungrounded. Eat some meat. Go for a walk. Other people were like, oh, you just got to keep going. Just get through it. And they were like, those are not compatible with each other. So I think that's really confusing. So that's Buddhism, but what about psychology? So within sense of self, there's something called, this is the DSM, so this is the APA. There's a really interesting little caveat. I don't know what to call it. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but I found this under depersonalization disorder, which is a kind of disorder where someone feels like a detached observer to their experience and basically loses their sense of self. And like within the category, in the DSM-4, there's this little paragraph, which I found, and it says, voluntarily induced experiences of depersonalization can be part of meditative practices and should not be diagnosed as a disorder. So like kind of like the cultural caveat, like, okay, if you did it intentionally, it's not a disorder, which is also very interesting. So for many years, it was like, can't bill for that because it's not a disorder. And then when I got the DSM-5 and read it really carefully to see if this little paragraph survived, there was another new paragraph. And this one said, however, there are individuals who initially induce these states intentionally, but over time lose control over them and may develop a fear and aversion for related practices. And then it's a disorder again, billable. So the point is that psychiatry is not going to help either. Like this is a mess, and there's a lot of different views at what it is. So it's up to us to figure this out. This is in no way, we're not going to get a consensus from other people. But for the longest time, for years, I was like, who is the person that wrote this? I have to find them. And I have to tell you that I met this person like 2 weeks ago. And his name is Roberto Luis Fernandez, and he's the chair of the dissociative disorders group. But it was like this amazing discovery to finally meet him. Okay, so there he is. Really, really nice guy. Okay, so what about relevance to MBIs? Is this relevant to MBIs? How many of you, I'm just curious, might as well take a poll while I'm up here. How many think it's relevant to MBIs? Okay, got some. So I think it is, and here's why. So a lot of the practices that people were reporting at onset, so that's the red bar, are pretty similar to the ones that we're offering in MBIs. So there's following your breath and just sitting, shikantaza, the body scan, vipassana. These are all, these are different traditions, descriptions of basically focused awareness and focused attention and open monitoring, but they're really what we offer in MBIs, a little bit of metta too. So I think that the type of practices is pretty similar. And then just like to circle back on practice amount. The ones in red, I think, the data in red, I think, are relevant, in that 12% of the sample started to have difficulties within their first 10 days, and 18% started to have difficulties within their first 50 hours, which is about how many hours you're in an MBSR course. So I think that, and again, there are a number of people, 25%, who encountered difficulties with 1 hour a day or less. So again, these are kind of the numbers that we see within MBIs. A couple comments about MBIs. I think some of the feedback that I get are like some of the shock that I get when I give this talk is, well, how come I've never heard of this before? And like there never been adverse effects in any of the like clinical trials that we've heard. Like this, how could this be, kind of thing. So I just want to point out that we haven't been doing a very good job of monitoring in MBIs so far, and that 75% of them rely on passive monitoring, which is basically waiting for the patient to volunteer information to us. And we know that actually doesn't work. It underestimates the actual prevalence by more than 20-fold. So I'm going to spend a lot of time at the workshop talking about how to monitor correctly and get accurate numbers. So one of which is that we need to ask specific questions, and like we don't know what questions to ask. But I think the code book that I produced will help with that. And also the person that asks the questions can't be the teacher, because we have a lot of demand characteristics and willingness, wanting to please the teacher. So those are just some of the tidbits that I will open up a little. Okay, so basically one of the things I did, and this is totally unpublished data, and so it's pretty preliminary, but we basically made a very preliminary kind of interview-based scale out of our code book. So you can see, if you look at it, we started with an open-ended question, which yielded nothing, by the way. So open-ended questions are kind of useless. But we went through each cluster, and we asked open-ended questions for each cluster, but then we asked specific questions for each of the 59 categories. And the person that did the interview was Jared Lindahl, who's the first author of the paper. So he was totally unaffiliated with we inserted this into a clinical trial of MBCT. I was one of the instructors in the clinical trial, and he was totally unaffiliated. The patients had never met him before, and he interviewed them 3 months after the trial had ended. So it was like the last thing that they got in the trial. And so basically, we were trying to see like how many of the categories that came up in the VCE study are showing up in MBIs. So this is some preliminary results. And you can see that, I can't even read these. Perceptual hypersensitivity, so the ones in red are the ones that seem to be the most common in the MBCT trial. Traumatic re-experiencing was a big one, emotional lability, and fear, or just increases in anxiety. So those were some of the ones that that were the most common within the MBCT trial. Although I just want to point out that some of the ones in yellow, so those would be, I can't read these, impaired executive functioning, involuntary movements, affective numbing, and depersonalization. Those are all could be different aspects of dissociation. So those are all good ones to just track. And I'm going to spend a lot of time in the workshop learning how to notice dissociation, because it can be really tricky, and it can look like calm. So you have to be very careful to know what to look for. Oh, a couple other things about, and you can ask me more questions about this trial. I didn't want to put too much out there today, because we're going to unpack it later, but that the same type of, very similar type of pattern, I would say, as the first trial, in that the categories replicated, in that they showed up in 85% of the people, and 95% of the categories, everything except hallucinations and delusions and sleep paralysis. Only 3 of the GCE categories didn't show up in an MBI. So like, you're gonna see this stuff, but it's not always a problem. And it was obviously much, much shorter duration, much milder. Sometimes it was just like a passing thing. So again, it's the same kind of situation where you have a huge variety of capacity, a huge variety of response. So many people had re-experiencing. That was one of the ones I think we should be watching. And for some people, like, it was part of their healing process. They worked with these really difficult emotions. They had the physiological capacity to digest them. They had the support system to digest them, and it was a really big part of their healing. And for other people, the re-experiencing, from given their history, it destabilized them, and it wasn't really a good thing for them. So I think it's, I would love to be able to give you a list of like, this is good, this is bad, but it's really dependent on like that particular person's history, social support, et cetera. So what about prevalence and frequency? So I'm a really bad person to estimate this because I've had over 300 people, they're still waiting for me, call me from about 18 different countries, and I get like several calls a week. So for me, this is like an epidemic, and it's all over the place, but it's really hard to estimate, exactly how frequent it is. I mean, within the MBI study, I would say, well, we know that, about 5% of people who go through any kind of psychological treatment have what they call lasting bad effects. So 5% is probably a good estimate, just generally speaking, if you're talking about psychological treatments. But we actually have no idea. So just to get a sense of like the people in this room. So how many of you have personally had a difficulty or personally know someone that has? So look around and see the hands, keep your hands up. So this is like pretty common, I would say. That's a pretty common like ratio. So I think, it's something that is happening that we're just not talking about, and now we are, and that's awesome. It was both, yeah. These are people who are native to those countries, yeah. Okay, so about neurobiological mechanisms. So first of all, we could potentially have 59 different mechanisms because there's a lot of different categories. So I don't think, again, like you're gonna keep hearing this from me, like one size does not fit all, there's not one answer to this, it's very complicated, blah, blah, blah. So I have broken it down to two mechanisms, two potential sort of directions. So there are, you could basically break down our code book into, in psychosis research, they call them positive symptoms and negative symptoms, which is really confusing because you think like positive is good or like happy, but positive means like something's added. So I call them additive. So additive categories would be like too much emotion, re-experiencing, like something was added, involuntary movements. And then the other kind would be like subtractive categories. This is called negative. And this would be like losing emotions, losing your sense of self. Something is subtracted from your normal experience. So you could potentially, we're working with some, looking at those types of, those two kind of different directions and looking at mechanisms for that. So within the subtractive categories, you have things like dissociation and a kind of hypoarousal, affective blunting. And that can be caused by prefrontal over-control of things like the limbic system, the autonomic nervous system, and the default mode network. So this is like, if you've seen any of the other research or my other talks on stress physiology, like meditation is pretty good at strengthening the prefrontal cortex and down-regulating the limbic system, and that can mimic a lot of the signs of dissociation. So this is what, I'll show you that in a second. And then the other one is the hyperarousal, so too much going on. And I have a couple different potential mechanisms. Again, this is all speculation at this point about why this might happen. But homeostatic neuroplasticity, that's our paper on the lights. We have an entire like sort of molecular model on why a kind of like concentration-based like a focus would, basically inhibiting sensory input would cause a general upregulation of sensory neuronal sensitivity. It's called homeostatic neuroplasticity. There's somatosensory amplification, there's dual representation theory, and there's relaxation-induced panic. So these are all, I'm putting these up here just so you know that there are theories that we're kind of working with. I'll unpack these more at the workshop. This is just to show you some of the neural correlates that are common between dissociation and meditation. that could potentially line up. Here's a brain version of that. And then here's sort of some of the similar kinds of, reduced sympathetic activation, increased parasympathetic activation, reduced cortisol, reduced emotional reactivity. There's a lot of the physiology does overlap, so I think it's something to consider. It's also interesting that one way it's known that you can induce dissociation in the lab by staring at a dot on the wall. It's like a classic way to induce dissociation, which I thought was really interesting. And also to reduce sensory input, or to repeat phrases like, I feel like a spectator watching what is happening here, which sounds kind of like some of the mindfulness instructions. So again, are there things that we're doing that might be unintentionally causing dissociation? Somatosensory amplification. There are a number of brain areas involved in generating emotion and emotion intensity. The insula, the cingulate cortex, the somatosensory cortex, and the amygdala, all of these are affected by meditation. I think it's important to understand that the insula isn't just about interoception, and that there's a lot of studies suggesting that insula activation is associated with trauma symptoms, anxiety, flashbacks, so that it's important to know all the literature about a certain brain area and not just think like, oh, insula, I have more body awareness. It's like, yes, and there's more to that. So like really getting more deeply into the literature. This is just a data showing that increased insula activation is associated with more trauma symptoms and less well-being, just to sort of hit that point a little more. I'm going to skip that one. So I'd like to offer sort of preliminary synthesis. I mean, just if it's not already obvious, like I'm also trying to figure this out. Like it's not obvious to me what's going on. I think we have these accounts and in the phenomenology, that's like about as far as we've gotten, is like we're pretty solid on that. But in terms of why it's happening or what the mechanism is or how we can make sense of these difficulties in light of the positive effects, like I'm still working on that. So here's like kind of one of my working models, which is, I think this might synthesize both the positive and the negative effects. And it has to do with this sort of U-shaped curve of like optimal performance. So many of you have seen this like in terms of like Hans Selye's, optimal performance and arousal. So if I'm, too low arousal right now, like I'm not going to be able to remember what my points were, and it's actually not going to be good for my speech if I'm just like really chilled out. But if I'm way too anxious and nervous, then I'm also not going to be optimally. I'm going to freak out. So there's an optimal, arousal level, right? Like arousal is not bad. You need some of it. So I think, and also that there's different people have different optimal arousals. So many other people are much calmer than I am, and that's their optimal. I tend to run a little high, and that's just like how I am, and that's my optimal. So, we all have different like kind of optimal set points for us. And so that's kind of the idea. So going back to like prefrontal inhibition of the limbic system, so if you have way too much emotion and you're feeling really agitated and like just hyper aroused, like a little suppression of the limbic system is going to be great, just what you need. But so you get into your optimal place and you're like feeling good, but if you keep going, it might be that it's kind of like overtraining. If you keep going, there might be like a place where you start to get a little flat and your emotions are like actually not optimal. So I think it's also, important to reflect on the fact that people have different ideals about what emotions they want to have and how much of an emotion they have. So there are very well documented, differences in cultural, we call ideal affect, and that certain cultures, for example, Christian, Latino, African American cultures tend to prefer more high arousal emotions. And many of the countries that these contemplative practices come from tend to prefer a different kind of, a more low arousal kind of affect. And so there's no right or wrong answer, but those are just different cultural preferences and sort of what we consider like well-being and good. It's a different kind of thing. So I think all of this is very relative to the person's own set points. That's my point. So that's the one for arousal, for emotion, and that could be the same thing for, decreasing the default mode network or selfing. That if I'm up here and I'm like, oh my God, what did they think of me? Am I doing okay? Am I doing okay? I don't know. How do I look? And I'm not. That's too much selfing, right? So maybe I need a little DMN, like chill out from the prefrontal cortex. So that would be good for me, and then I have an optimal, right? But maybe there is a place where, like, I want to be able to feel my body and know that I own these arms and that I am the one producing these words, that kind of thing. So there might be an optimal place for me and for us as a culture about where we are in terms of sense of self. So that's where I want to go with the last tiny bit of time that I have left, is just asking us, like, about the role of culture. And just to reflect on the fact that the contemplative practices that we're applying here in the West came from a really different culture than the one we're in right now. It's like really obvious, and it's really different than ours. So I think I don't have time to get into this. I think this is a super important topic. So I'm just going to kind of refer to you to a couple of books that I think are really totally required reading. One of them is called The Making of a Buddhist Modernism by David McMahon. And it basically describes how the cultural differences, East-West differences, impact how Buddhism is being received and modified by the West. And this is us, we're in this. So it's really important to understand what our extended context is and all the influences that we have and how we're interpreting Buddhism. The second one is by Richard Nesbitt, and it's called The Geography of Thought: How Asians and Westerners Think Differently and Why. So this one is basically an introduction, really reader-friendly introduction to something called situated cognition. John described embodied cognition yesterday, that we're not just our minds and our brains, but we're in a body, and the body is acting in the world, and that's super important. Situated cognition goes even further, that we're not just a body in the world, but we're in a social world, and the social world impacts us, and the cultural world impacts us. So extended cognition goes even further to say that our social cultural world may even constitute some of our cognitive being, which is actually kind of a really Buddhist thing to say. So I think it's something worth unpacking even more, that we need to take culture into account. So in terms of how this might impact what I'm saying about specifically the sense of self category. I'm getting this strange thing here. Sorry. Just got an error message in here. So just breathe in and out or whatever you do. Okay, so what I wanted to say was the role of the self, our cultural construal of the self, might impact how we experience these meditation experiences. So I just want to unpack that one category, sense of self, in a cultural way, just to give you an example of why that might be. So the West is something we call individualistic, and has a certain kind of self-construal. This is a chart where the vertical axis, we have the individualism score of 21 countries, and the frequency of depersonalization, which is a loss of sense of self that is experienced as unpleasant and distressing, on the vertical axis. And this graph basically tells us that countries that are higher on this cultural variable, individualism, have a more unpleasant kind of loss of sense of self. What's really interesting about this graph is if you look up the countries on it, it's important to notice that the places where many of these practices originated, India, Japan, Thailand, are on the complete opposite end of the spectrum than the US, Europe, and Canada. People in the West don't tend to flourish when they lose their sense of self. In fact, depersonalization has a very high suicide rate. So the point is if we're really willing to be receptive to cultural differences, we need to consider the possibility that contemplative practices that were intended to undermine the sense of self may have a very favorable effect in one culture and a not so favorable effect in another culture that has a different kind of self-construal. And I think it's really tempting to be like, but we'll just change our self-construal. That'll just be like, we'll just be more collectivist. And I think that's really tempting, but I think it's really hard. So our self-construal is even different on a neural level. So this is something that is very, very hard to change. And I think, in the term that's being used in cultural psychology and situated cognition is culture, mind, brain, life world. And this means that our experiences are not only situated in our brains and body, but also in our microculture, our larger culture, which has its own unique history. And the background assumptions of that culture are invisible to us, but also permeate every level. So to give you some examples, like I'm from America, obviously, and I've been in the UK for a while, and you do strange things, in my opinion. So I don't know what's up with the saucers that always have to go with the tea. We don't have saucers, why? So that's not what I'm talking about. That's superficial, ooh, cultural differences, hee. I'm talking about deep assumptions. So for example, I believe that women deserve equal rights. Anyone else share that opinion? Yeah. So that's an example. So I feel like that is not a belief. It's not a value. It's a self-evident truth. It's basic human rights. It's just true. But it's also a cultural belief that most of the world doesn't share, and if you look at the history of humankind, hasn't shared. So it's actually a culturally conditioned belief that I am pretty sure about. So that's the level that we're talking about, and if we're going to start messing with background assumptions, we should be asking are we really sure that that's a good idea? It's okay to do that, but I think we should be really sure that it's a good idea before we do. So I think just to kind of go back to the issue of diversity and individual differences, I think we just need to pause, and I've been so happy to see that this is already happening at this conference, and just really start to consider each individual in their own situated context, their own, unique individual. I actually learned the word bespoke today. I don't know if it's I've never heard that word before. I think it's British, but I was that's the perfect word for this ending. So that is what we're talking about. Each individual person has their own situated context, and really thinking about how these practices apply to them in that way specifically, according to their values and where they want to go. And I think that's where we're going as a field, and I'm so happy to see that that's already happening. So thank you so much for listening to me. And if you want to hear more, I have a whole day of this, so come see me again. So thank you so much.